Hey guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at World War I. So we're going to be covering several different worksheets here. So the first is the causes of World War I worksheet. So you can see like it's got long-term causes, immediate cause, then down at the bottom, should U.S. enter the war. Then we are going to be looking at this one, which at the top says fighting over there. And then at the bottom it says over here. So this is looking at the war itself and the home front in the U.S. And then finally, we will go to the end of the war, which has different boxes. At the top, cost of the war, then Paris Peace Conference, 1919, going on from there. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So as we get started with World War I, a couple things that I think are important to remember. First of all, when the war began, it was right at the beginning of Woodrow Wilson's administration, the first time he's elected. And the United States is trying to practice neutrality. They want to stay out of it. A lot of people think that this is Europe's war. The United States has no business being involved in it. And that's going to be kind of how Wilson maintains his first term in office. In fact, when Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, he ran on an anti-war platform. He opposed the war. He actually ran as a peace candidate. You see the pin at the bottom corner of the screen there where it says War in Europe, Peace in America, God bless Wilson. So this is like the idea that he kept us out of the war, right? So that's why you should re-elect Wilson. But as we are going to see, that does not hold for very long. So let's jump into the causes of the war. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of world history review. So you should have a good idea of this already, so we're going to go through it kind of quickly. So the first thing that you will notice is the long-term causes spell out the word main, M-A-I-N. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. So you can also call these the main causes of the war. And if you can remember what those letters stand for, then you'll be able to remember what they are. So the first is militarism. Basically, there's a massive arms race in Europe where all of the military powers are starting to build up their militaries. The one that most of the countries are doing is their naval forces. So particularly Germany starts to build up their navy. If you look like where Germany is on the map, right? It's pretty close to England. England's got a pretty powerful navy already, so England kind of sees this as a way that Germany is threatening Great Britain because they're pretty close together, whereas Germany sees it as kind of a way that if they need to, they can match Great Britain in their navy. So the arms race is the first thing that people are doing here. The second is alliances. So there are two major alliances in Europe at this time. The first is the Triple Entente, and there are a lot of people in these alliances, but these are the big ones. So we've got France, Britain, and Russia. So these are going to be the Triple Entente here. The Triple Alliance is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And Italy will actually end up changing sides in April of 1915. So after the war starts, they join Britain and France and Russia. But before the war, they are allied with Germany. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind as we're looking at these. So you may wonder why alliances might be a cause of a war. That's going to play a role into one of the immediate causes. So keep that in your mind when we're come back to that. The second one that we have here is imperialism. So look at this political cartoon in the upper right-hand corner of the page. You see that there's a bulldog, and Britain is often represented as a bulldog in political cartoons and stuff. So we've got Britain in the dead center of the Union Jack flag, which is the British flag. It says, "Are we afraid? No. And why not?" Because look what surrounds Britain. We've got Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, South Africa. So these are all of Britain's major colonies. So they're basically saying we can defend ourselves on any continent in the world, right? We've got North America, we've got South America, or not really South America, but we've got North America, we've got Asia, we've got Africa, we've got like Indonesia. We are good, right? So the idea here is that imperialism is causing people to compete over these worldwide colonies. So think about like what we saw with the Spanish-American War, that Spain and the United States were competing over who got to control Cuba. This kind of stuff is going on in Africa. Nations are competing over African colonies in Southern Asia, like India and Indonesia and that part of the world. So all of these major European powers are basically fighting each other over who gets to control what colony. When the war breaks out, That's what makes this a world war, because they're going to keep fighting in the colonies as well as in Europe, okay? The last one we have is nationalism. So nationalism was a movement that began in the late 1800s, and basically there's this sense of national pride, and a nation in this sense is not necessarily your political boundaries. The way that I like to think of it is, I am a United States citizen, right? So that's my nation, that's my political boundary. But culturally, I'm Southern, right? So that you could almost consider to be my nation, which is Southern culture, Southern, language, so to speak, Southern heritage. That's what's kind of going on in Europe, except on a grander scale. So in the Austrian Empire, you might have people who are Serbian, who live in Austria, and that's their political nation, but they consider themselves Serbian. And that's what they consider their nation. You can see this over here. This is playing at Irish nationalism, right? So this idea that one Irishman can defeat 10 Germans, right? So join an Irish regiment today, join an Irish national regiment. And a lot of these ethnic groups are wanting their own political boundaries. So groups like the Polish people, Slavics, Serbs, those are ones that are big in Austria-Hungary, Bosnia, and all of these different places. So this is kind of all the stuff that's simmering in the background, right? This stuff has been going on for a long time, since the mid-1800s, and it's always there, and it's causing tension, and it's causing conflict, but you need something to make it all boil over, and a spark that gets all of these things blown up, right? So that spark is the immediate cause, and that is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of Austria, and he was the next in line to be the new leader of the Austrian-Hungary Empire, okay? So you see basically what the idea is. Austria owned a lot of nations in Europe. They had a lot of territory, and a lot of these nations didn't want to be a part of Austria. So there's one particular group, the Serbians, who form a nationalist group known as the Black Hand. And the Black Hand is really unhappy with Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So one of the Serbian nationalists plans an assassination attempt. Franz Ferdinand and his wife are in an open car, like a parade, and they actually had attempted to shoot him once already and missed, but then they do manage to gun him down, and he and his wife are both killed. You can see the photograph from their funeral down there at the bottom. And so Austria freaks out. Their crown prince has been murdered, right? So Austria starts to blame Serbia. And they're like, dude, you owe us recompense for this. Well, Russia decides they want to back Serbia up. So Russia tells Austria that if they declare war on Serbia, then Serbia's going to back up, or Russia's going to back up Serbia, right? So Russia ends up declaring war on Austria-Hungary. Well, Austria-Hungary is allied with Germany. And so when Germany finds out that Russia has declared war on Austria, they declare war on Russia. Well, Russia's allies, France and Great Britain, are like, this can't happen. So then they declare war on Germany. And you can see how this is kind of a ripple effect, right? These alliances, because they were so entangled, what should have been a local issue between Austria and Serbia blows up into this major worldwide conflict between all of Europe and really the whole world. So war officially begins in July of 1914. So that's kind of where we begin this. So as the war breaks out in Europe, immediately there are people who start questioning whether or not the United States should join in on this conflict. So that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time. So this is an analogy here to just kind of help you remember this. So a lot of times you'll hear Europe called a powder keg. So a powder keg is a barrel, like you see here, that's full of gunpowder, right? So we're going to pretend inside the powder keg of Europe are our main causes, right? Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. And they just need one spark to make them explode, right? And what is that one spark? Well, it's this. So that's going to lead to Europe starting to simmer and grow, right? Until eventually this is what's going to happen. all of Europe explodes, right? So that's where we start with World War I. This is an interesting political cartoon. It says, the title of it is The Crime of the Ages, Who Did It? So what is the crime? Look at the back of the political cartoon there. There's a woman who's been stabbed, right? And who is this woman? She is the peace of Europe. So the peace of Europe has been murdered. Who did it? Well, everybody is pointing fingers at somebody else. Serbia is pointing fingers at Austria, who's pointing fingers at Serbia. Germany's pointing at Russia, who's pointing at Austria. Belgium and England and France are pointing at Germany. Italy's kind of like over here twiddling its thumbs, like, I'm just going to stay out of this for a while. Remember, Italy is allies with Germany and Austria, but you'll notice they weren't part of that ripple effect. They actually kind of waited out. They're going to wait until this war kind of gets going before they decide what they're going to do. And as we know, who do they end up allying with? England and France, right? So Italy's kind of a turncoat, and Britain and France never completely trust Italy, and that's going to play an important role later, so remember that. So the United States is now questioning whether or not they should enter the war. So there's two sides. There are the side that's supporting the entry and the side who supports neutrality, who says we need to keep maintaining our neutral state here. So here's some of the events that gave way to the side that supported entry. So the first thing is Germany had commenced something called unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany had invented a submarine called the U-boat, which was a really phenomenal invention here at the time. It's one of the only submarines that any side has. That was part of their militarism. And they make a pledge with the United States very early on in the war called the Sussex Pledge. And basically what they say is like, look, we're going to be attacking ships. But since you're neutral, we promise that we're not going to attack any United States ships, right? Like, as long as U.S. merchant ships are out there, we're going to leave them alone. Well, unfortunately, they start to violate that, and they start attacking U.S. merchant ships. But it gets even worse when they start attacking passenger vessels. And one of the passenger vessels that they attack is the Lusitania. So the Lusitania was like a cruise ship, essentially, and it was leaving from Ireland, and there were 128 Americans on board. The ship is bombed, it's torpedoed by German U-boats, it sinks in less than 15 minutes, and all 128 Americans on board the Lusitania are killed. There is an outcry in the United States. The Germans said that they thought that the ship had weapons on it, and that's why they were trying to sink it. It was also a British ship. That was their enemy. However, this is, like I said, like a cruise ship, right? So Americans freak out because of this. And this is going to start kind of encouraging a lot of those people. The next thing that happens is that there are a lot of economic ties that we have with Britain and France. So basically we've loaned them money, we trade with them, they are kind of our closest allies in the world anyway. So a lot of people feel like because we have these economic ties with them, that we should support them in the war. At the very least, we should be like giving them supplies and money and that sort of thing. The last thing that happens, and this is kind of the one that sets everything off, is the Zimmerman note. So the Zimmerman note was a telegraph that was sent from the German Secretary of State, whose name was Zimmerman, to the ambassador of Mexico in Germany, or from Germany to Mexico, right? So this is a German guy that is the ambassador in Mexico. So what this note did, what this telegraph said is, you need to propose to the president of Mexico an alliance where if we can't keep the U.S. out of this war, Germany wanted to keep the U.S. neutral, but if we can't keep the United States neutral, we want you to ally with us so that there is an enemy at the gates for America. And what we want you to do is attack them. And at the end of the war, we'll give you back all of the territory you've ever lost. Well, this telegram is intercepted. That never makes it to Mexico. And when this is published in American newspapers, there is outcry because they've just basically said, we want to keep the U.S. out of the war, but just in case, here's, an alliance that we can come up with. So the factors supporting neutrality, there are a couple things here. The first is isolationism. So basically what this idea is that the United States wants to isolate itself. This is a European conflict. We need to stay out of it, mind our own business. We were not involved in this. We don't care about their colonies. We don't care about their empires. This is not an American thing. We have no business being involved in it. people started to argue that with the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman note, that it has become an American thing, right? And that's eventually going to be the reason that Wilson does declare war. The other thing is an economic thing. So this is similar to the economic ties, where basically there was this accusation that we were only going to war to protect our investors. And that just wasn't a good enough reason for a lot of people. Basically, if all we're doing is going to war to help Britain out because we want to trade with them, that's not a good enough reason to kill American men, right? So that's the argument there, the two arguments against neutrality. As you can see, there are more arguments that support the entry for a lot of people. So this is just an excerpt from the Zimmerman note. I just highlighted some of the important parts here. So at the beginning, he says, we intend to begin submarine warfare unrestricted. So whoever we run into, we're going to bomb them, right? However, it is still our intention to keep the U.S. neutral. Even though we're going to torpedo American ships, we still want to keep them out of this, right? However, if our attempt is not successful, we propose an alliance on the following basis with Mexico: that we shall make war together and together make peace. We shall give general financial support to Mexico. It is understood that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. You are instructed to inform the President of Mexico of the above in the greatest confidence as soon as it is certain that there will be an outbreak of war with the U.S. Okay? So as soon as we figure out the U.S. is going to declare war, you need to go to the President of Mexico, and he needs to be able to sign up on this, and then he needs to go to Japan and form another alliance with Japan so that they can attack Hawaii and the West Coast. Well, you can imagine when this gets out, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Right? That's a terrible thing. So essentially what we're going to do now is we are going to officially declare war based on this note. A couple other quick little images here. So this is just a newspaper article in the New York Times about the sinking of the Lusitania, basically saying there's a lot of people dead. 1,260 refers to the total number of people on board. There were just 128 Americans. But you can see that this is something that a lot of people are saying. This is going to be a big issue. A grave crisis is at hand. This one is a political cartoon titled Germany Under All. So this refers to Germany's submarine warfare. If you look at this political cartoon, Germany looks very menacing, right? It's a hand underneath the ocean that you can't see, and they're coming up to grab these vessels. It's hard to tell, but these are like teeny tiny little ships, right, that are being grabbed by Germany or torpedoed by Germany. This one, says John Bull uses the American flag for protection. John Bull is like the British version of Uncle Sam. And so if you look, there is a British submarine and a British vessel, the Lusitania, right? But what kind of flag is he flying? He's flying an American flag. So the idea is that he was using an American flag in the hopes that there would be some protection. So he's basically like taking advantage of it. And if you read the cartoon, the German sailor says, "Who is it, that boat?" And the British guy says, "Can't you see I'm a bloomin' Yankee?" Right? Again, taking advantage of this when he's obviously not a bloomin' Yankee, right? He's a British guy. And then finally this one, the crowning achievement, this latest submarine victim may be the last. And what is the latest submarine victim? U.S. patience, right? So basically the United States is done. They've run out of patience. They're declaring war on Germany. So Woodrow Wilson declares war on April 2nd, 1917. Make sure you write that on your paper here. And let me just read you this excerpt from his war declaration speech. And it'll give you a good idea of Wilson's motivations. It is a war against all nations. American ships have been sunk, American lives taken, in ways in which it has stirred us very deeply to learn of. But the ships and people of other neutral and friendly nations have been sunk and overwhelmed in the waters in the same way. There has been no discrimination. The challenge is to all mankind. Each nation must decide for itself how it will meet it. The choice we make for ourselves must be made with moderation of counsel and temperateness of judgment, befitting our character and our motives as a nation. We must put excited feeling away. Our motive will not be revenge or the victorious assertion of the physical might of the nation, but only the vindication of right, of human right, of which we are only a single champion. So why is Woodrow Wilson declaring war? What is he saying his motivation is? Does it have anything to do with the American vessels, the lives that have been sunk, or have been taken, the ships that have been sunk? No. It's a human rights issue, where basically he's saying that the Germans are taking advantage of human rights all over the world, and we are the champion of human rights. So this goes into his philosophy of moral diplomacy, right? Where we want to take care of the human rights issues in the world. So that is why, a year after he runs as the peace candidate, he declares war on April 2nd, 1917. So let's move on to the next worksheet. Over there was a song that was actually pretty popular at the time. You might have heard it before. It goes, over there, say the word, over there. For the Yanks are coming, or come drumming over there. So over there is kind of the nickname for fighting the war. So that's what we're going to take a look at here. So first of all, let's look at the new tactics and weapons. The key to remember about World War I is it is the first modern war, right? All wars after World War I will be based on the way this war was fought, and that is important. The first thing to know about this is that this is a war of trench warfare. So basically what this means is that the soldiers dig in, there's one trench on this side, one trench on this side, and they are dug in, firing at each other, hoping that they can get them to evacuate their trench, right? And so they can move, okay? This is a rough way of fighting. I'm going to show you some pictures in just a second, and we'll talk about it in class a little bit more. But trench warfare is brutal, and it is also slow. You're going to hear this war called a stalemate war, and that's because there's not really a whole lot of movement, not really a lot of land that is gained, which is very different from any kind of war that has really ever been fought since then or before then. No man's land is the area between the trenches, so we'll get into what that's all about in a second here. The next thing that we do is convoy support. So this goes into the German submarine warfare. So they were firing on merchant vessels, right? But we still have to get cargo and shipments overseas. So what we would do is basically we would have maybe like a couple ships that are cargo ships. Well, we'd send them out with the U.S. Navy, and like 10 or 20 ships would basically escort these merchant ships to England. So that way, if they are attacked, hopefully the Navy will be able to step in and protect these merchant ships so that they can get to where they need to go. The idea is that we want to outgun the torpedoes, right? The next thing that we do is send a force called the American Expeditionary Force. This is led by a guy named John Pershing. This is the same man who led the hunt for Pancho Villa. So John Pershing, his big thing was he wanted to keep the American army separate from the British and the French and the Russians. He did not want to combine their troops. So he wanted to keep the Americans apart from that. The Americans actually got the nickname the Doughboys. So if you think about dough, like it's malleable, it's young, it's new, right? Like it's very pure. This is because these Americans were so gung-ho. This war had already been going on for almost 4 years by the time the American forces get there. So the troops of European countries are exhausted, and they see these young gung-ho guys coming in, and it gives them a new hope. But it's also a way that they picked fun at the Americans at first, kind of made fun of them for being these fresh young dough, right? But the Americans eventually took it on as a badge of honor. One of the things that Pershing did is he wanted to just throw as much force at the Germans and the Austrians as he could. So this led to the other nickname that we have here of the Americans as cannon fodder. So what this means is Pershing says, if we can just overwhelm them with troops, we're going to lose a lot of men. But if we overwhelm them, then they're going to surrender, right? So these men are cannon fodder or food for the cannon, right? But the overwhelming number of them is going to eventually end the war. So that's kind of his strategy here. This is also a war of chemical warfare. And this is kind of the first time this happens, where chlorine and mustard gas are the two that are used the most. But these two gases, basically, when you breathe them in, They affect your central nervous system, your lungs, and it's almost like it burns you up from the inside out. It's pretty terrible stuff. The Germans were the first to use this, but eventually both sides did. Gas masks became the most important tool that you had at your disposal if you were in a trench. But this is also a war that's mechanized and large scale. When I say mechanized, I mean like it uses machines, right? So we have a new kind of machine gun that can shoot over 600 rounds a minute. That's a ton of bullets at once, right? Then we have the invention of the tank, the airplane, bombers. There's these cannons called the Big Bertha cannons. They're these huge cannons that shoot artillery at long distances. We have these observation balloons where essentially they would send these balloons up and they would use them to spy on people. This is huge. This is the change where we go from old style charging at each other on horseback, fighting each other with sabers, to blowing each other up, essentially. So war changes a lot during World War I. Some of the major events that take place during this war. So first we have the German Scheifler Plan. This was their kind of strategy at the beginning of the war. So they were fighting this war on two fronts, right? In Russia and in France, okay? Their job is like, okay, we want to hold Russia back and storm through Paris, called the Blitz, right? Where they want to run in through Paris, through Belgium, run into Paris through Belgium, overtake France, defeat France, and then go back and defeat Russia. Doesn't really work for them because once they hit France, they dig those trenches and they don't really go anywhere. But most of the fighting takes place in Russia and France, okay? So just an example, there's a lot of battles we could talk about, but the Battle of the Somme is probably the biggest battle that lets you know what this war was all about. So these battles, the thing to remember is that they don't actually take place in one day. Sometimes they take place over a series of months. This particular battle takes place between June and November of 1916. And just to give you an idea of how little territory is gained, right? 1.2 million men are killed in these few months of the Battle of the Somme, okay? Only 7 miles of ground is exchanged in those few months, either direction. So there's not a lot of movement. This is what we call a war of attrition, not a war of movement, right? Where we're basically tearing each other down, but we're not gaining a whole lot, okay? So the other big thing that happens in this war, in 1918, right near the end of the war, Russia has a revolution at home. They change their government. Lenin becomes control of the government. They change to a communist government, and they actually signed their very own treaty with Germany at this time and withdraw from the war. So Russia basically drops out just before the war ends. This allows the Germans to take all the troops that they had in Russia and send them over to France. And Germany is really hoping that this will kind of help them out a lot more, maybe make them win. It's kind of their final push. Unfortunately, there's just too much damage to the German military. They're not able to do it. And they just can't withstand the new American forces that have just arrived. So just about the same time that the Russians surrendered, the Americans showed up, and they just can't handle all these new troops that have come up. So eventually the Americans push the Germans out of France. The Kaiser, the leader of Germany, is kicked off the government, kicked off the throne of France and sent into exile, and Germany surrenders. So it's really, the Americans come in at the last minute and help France and Britain really win this war when they thought that all hope had kind of been lost. So I'm just going to show you some pictures here. This is a picture of the convoy. So, for example, what you might have is just a couple little merchant ships, right? But then they're surrounded by all of these U.S. naval vessels in order to protect them. So that way they can get to where they need to go safely. This is a map that just shows you the eastern front of this war. So this was the front in France. And you can see the line of the trenches here. And if you look, this really shows you how little territory is gained or lost. I was talking about the Battle of the Somme. Going back here, you can see that not much land is gained there, right? This is a battle called the Battle of Bellewood. This is one of the few non-trench battles and just gives you a good picture of the American forces here in Bellewood and what that might have been like. This shows you again, the two fronts. So we've got the Western Front, the Western Front, the Italian Front, and over here the front in Russia. This just shows you a picture of the layout of the trenches. So what you see here, the trenches start way back in the back, where you've got your big Bertha artillery guns here at the back, and they can fire over the trenches onto any of the men that might be advancing on them here. Then you have your communication trenches. So these are the trenches where the people who are in reserve wait, like if they're going to the front lines, or if they're trying to get messages out. These are the people back here. We've got concrete blocks set up for machine guns. This is the support trench, again, in order to kind of help out the front lines here. You can see that they have dugouts where if there was some artillery fire, then you could go underground and maybe like hide out until the Germans were gone. Most of the dugouts wouldn't provide a whole lot of protection, but as you can see, like it says, some German ones were constructed so well that they actually would be protected. These are just places you could pop down into if they started firing at you. Then we have our frontline trench. So these are the boys in the front. In front of your trench, you'd have barbed wire to make it harder to people to get to you. And then this area between the trenches is known as no man's land. It's not land that is controlled by any one group. It's kind of the land you are trying to get control of. It's going to be muddy and messy and gross and just a devastating place to be. These trenches would fill up with water. They might not be taller than 7 feet tall, and so if you were a tall guy, you have a hard time surviving in these trenches. They're cramped. I mean, overall, this is a tough place to be. This picture here, just a picture of some of these new machine guns, like I said, that fire like 60 rounds per minute. You can see these guys in the bottom picture have got a rudimentary gas mask on to protect themselves from the gas. This is just some pictures of what trench warfare would be like. So you can see how narrow and short the trenches are in this bottom picture. Another major problem that they would have is the buildup of water in the trenches. Oftentimes they would not even be able to bury their dead. They'd have to be there with the dead bodies of their fallen comrades in the trenches with them. But what they would do is they would go up over the edge of the trench and fire. Okay, so you see this is a picture of some German artillery here firing over the trenches, and probably some American or British forces that are trying to invade. This particular picture is a picture of those big Bertha cannons I was telling you about. So if you compare it to the size of the men in the picture, that gives you a big idea of how big these things were. They could shoot for a long distance, long range here. At the top is a picture of some of the chlorine and mustard gas I was telling you about. And then at the bottom, you've got the airplanes. This is the first time airplanes are used in a war. These are called biplanes. You may have heard of like the Red Baron, who was a famous German bomber in planes. And so it was kind of like a legend that came out from this war. Then finally, I got a picture here of some of those first tanks. So again, you can see it's pretty rudimentary to what you think of a tank today, but you still, if your option is a tank or a horse, I think the tank wins, right? So this is just a picture of what I was talking about when I say the American doughboys are like young and fresh. You see these guys, they look ready to fight, right? They're happy. This poster over here is talking about how the doughboys are making good, right? Like they're helping the Allies win this war. And you can see them working with their machine gun there. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is over here. So in the U.S. home front, what were some changes in the way of life that we had at home? So the first thing that we had to do is mobilize. So mobilization means get ready for war. And so there are several different problems that we need to take care of as we are mobilizing here. So the first one is that we need men to fight, right? So Wilson actually institutes the Selective Service Act, which is a draft. So you might have heard of the draft. If you are 18, you have registered for the draft if you are a young man. So selective service is just the fancy word for draft. So young men were actually being drafted into this war. Of course, there were enlistment recruitments to volunteer, and there was quite a bit of volunteering, but there was a lot of draft as well. The other thing that they need is money. Wars are expensive, so we need this money to fight this war. First thing that Wilson does is institute higher taxes, particularly the income tax. So that 30% of my paycheck that comes out of every month, that started really here with this war. The other thing they would do is sell bonds. So bonds are basically loans to the government, which is where they get these nicknames, the Liberty Loan or the Victory Loan. So essentially what you do is, let's say you want to buy a bond. So you go and you say, I want to buy a $20 bond. You pay $18 for that $20 bond, okay? So you've just loaned $18 to the government. Then, in like 10 years, that bond starts to mature in value, right? So by 10 years, that bond is worth $20. If you keep it for longer, if you keep it for 20 years, it might be worth $30. If you keep it for 50 years, it might be worth $100. So eventually, you can cash that back in and get your interest on your bond. But it's a way for the government to raise money in a time of war, and it's something that's pretty popular in both World War I and World War II. The next issue is the industry. So basically, they need to use the industry in order to build weapons and machinery for the war. So Wilson passes two laws. First is the War Industries Board, and the War Industries Board kind of oversees mass production in the United States. It converts factories into factories that instead of producing cars, maybe they produce planes, right? So converting factories into factories that would use military weaponry. They might have the National Labor Board. The National Labor Board was meant to settle labor disputes. Basically, they didn't want you going on strike, right? If you went on strike, it was going to slow down industry. So the National War Labor Board is ordered to prevent labor unions from being able to strike and settling those disputes as quickly as possible. The last thing that we need is food production. A lot of our men who were farmers went off to fight, and we ship a lot of food to those men overseas. So we had to figure out, how are we going to save food in our country so we can ship it overseas and not go into a shortage of food? So what they do, sorry for this, is develop the U.S. Food Administration. It's headed by a guy named Herbert Hoover, whose name might sound familiar. He goes on to become president. But the U.S. Food Administration encouraged you to save your food, to grow your own gardens, to not throw out leftovers, and basically it allowed the U.S. government to maintain the food in the United States, the food production in the United States. So this is just some photos here. The first one is a poster, they're both from the food production. So the first one says, "Sir, don't waste while your wife saves. Adopt the doctrine of the clean plate. Do your share." In other words, eat all your food, don't throw it out, don't waste it. Over here, we've got the sow the seeds of victory, raise and plant your own vegetables. That way, you don't have to be able to buy them, right? So those vegetables can be sent to our boys overseas. The one other thing that they really needed to do is learn how to sway public opinion. Remember, this war for about half the people in the country was not popular. So they also established the Committee of Public Information. This was headed by a guy named George Creel, and his job is to sell the war. He wants to, or this administration's job is to get people on board with this war. So this is where propaganda comes in. So propaganda is biased communication. It's designed to influence people's opinions, and you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can say, like, well, you need to protect your country from this mad brute, the German up there, right? Or maybe you can help Uncle Sam out by buying war bonds, right? So stamp out the Kaiser, buy a war bond. It's this idea of the bandwagon or protection, or it's the American way. So the idea here is to influence you, right? Last thing that we've got here is the change in civil liberties in the United States. So first of all, what are civil liberties? Okay, so you haven't taken civics yet, probably. But civil liberties are those things that we have, like the right to life, liberty, free speech, those things that are promised in the Bill of Rights. Those are our civil liberties. So during this time period, there is a massive immigrant hysteria in this country. So who do you think that they are discriminating against? What is the group of immigrants? Well, I hope you said German, because that's right. To some extent, Italian, but not as much. Remember, we are technically allies with Italy, but Italians kind of get a raw deal anyway. So you might see posters, part of the propaganda campaign, that go up like this: "I like dogs, but not this breed." Poor Dachshund. I feel bad for him. He can't help that he's a German breed, right? Or they might change their name of their dog. Instead of walking your Dachshund, you might walk your Liberty Pup. Instead of eating sauerkraut, you might be eating Liberty Coleslaw, right? So they would change the names of different German foods to make it sound more American. They wouldn't just do this with food, however. In fact, German teachers were getting fired from public schools. If you look, this is from Ohio here, German professors are censored. They can't say everything they want to say. German collections and books removed from the public library. Businesses with German names were Americanized. They couldn't even speak German in public. If you look on the back of this sign, it tells about all the different streets that get renamed. So you can't have Berlin Street, so they change it to Woodrow Street. You can't have Habsburg Street, so you change it to Merrimack Street, right? So this was pretty common. And there's a lot of discrimination against Germans in this time. In fact, they actually passed a series of laws called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And these laws made it illegal to speak against the government, right? Mainly they're targeting immigrants and socialists. So socialists were really anti-war. And so the idea here is that they were the ones, like labor unions, particularly like the Wobblies, that really radical labor union, were speaking against the war. And these guys, their goal was to kind of stamp out any sort of discontent, any sort of opposition to the war. If you look at this here, this political cartoon, Woodrow Wilson is the teacher. He says, take a seat up front where I can watch you and you won't be looking over anyone's shoulder. And who is he saying this to? A German American, right? So we are limiting what here? We're limiting free speech, right? But this is upheld by a court case. Schnick versus the U.S. upheld that in times of war, you can limit civil liberties. That's a big deal. I don't know if you would be happy about that, but I certainly wouldn't be. So that's kind of where we are. And again, what do they violate? They violate freedom of speech, right? Last one we have here is social change at home. So you've got all these men who went off to fight, right? Most of them are white, right? So that leaves a couple groups of people at home who have some new opportunities open to them. This begins something we call the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is the movement of African Americans from southern cities to northern cities. So the highest population of African Americans was in the South before this. Why would that be? Where were slaves? These are the descendants of slaves, right? So a lot of them end up leaving the South, where they're facing a lot of discrimination anyway, and they're moving up north to take a lot of these factory jobs that have been vacated by these white men who joined the military. So if you look at this really cool painting at the top here, you see that there are all of these African Americans who are going to Chicago, New York, St. Louis. The idea is that there are more opportunities open to them up there. And there's massive numbers, I don't know the exact numbers, but massive numbers of population change in African Americans in the South and the North. The other thing that changes is women in the workplace. It becomes more acceptable for women to take some of these jobs that are held by men. It's not as high spread as it is during World War II, but it still begins there where women are starting to get some of their own freedom and independence. That's where we're going to wrap up with this particular video today. I will see you next time for the end of the war video, and I'll see you in class. Goodbye.